It was already too late to withdraw their forces, and the Germans encircled and destroyed many of the Soviet formations near the town of Uman. The Soviets now abandoned western Ukraine. They deployed the first wave of freshly mobilized troops, and during the first days of the war, the German forces encircled most of its formations near the towns of Bialystok and Minsk. In the Baltics, at the same time, Army Group Center had finished encircling the Soviet Western Front, and its infantry units began to reduce the pockets, while its armored forces advanced eastwards almost unopposed. But it was not enough, and as the German offensive continued, their armor broke through the Soviet lines and trapped these units near Smolensk. However, the performance of these newly created units was lackluster, and they were unable to liberate the pocket. The Germans managed to close it up and eliminate it. Bad infrastructure. Nevertheless, they were making slow but steady progress. The Soviets had anticipated that the Germans would continue their attack towards Moscow and concentrated their troops on this direction, which allowed the German armored formations to push back the weaker Soviet units on their southern flank. The German advance. As the groups met, most of the Soviet units in the central Ukraine became encircled. 750,000 men were trapped in the pocket. This allowed the Germans to carry out another encirclement, trapping part of the Soviet forces on the coast of the Black Sea. Once again, near the towns of Vyazma and Bryansk, the Soviet troops were encircled, and this resulted in halving the Soviet strength on the front. After reducing the pockets, the Germans closed their distance to Moscow in order to bypass and cut off the German units. Despite of moving behind the German lines, they did not have enough strength to cut the main railway supplying the German forces, and the Germans were able to cut off and contain the breakthroughs. In the north, the Soviets encircled the German Second Corps at Demyansk, but it was sustained by air supply. In the most critical sectors, they destroyed some Soviet units in the Army Group Center's rear. They went on an offensive of their own. The Red Army did not anticipate such a move, and the German units managed to cut off the attacking Soviet troops and destroy them, and cut the neck of the salient. During the next month, the encircled Soviet forces were eliminated, and they proceeded to clear out the pocket south of the railroad. Soon, they had full control over the territory. They turned against the northern salient. They cut its communications with the main Soviet front and pushed into it, eliminating most of the Soviet units. They conducted two smaller attacks, but this time the Soviets pulled their forces back and did not offer strong resistance. The amount of prisoners taken was limited. Moscow and deployed the reserves, conducting a counterattack from this direction. In the south, the Red Army began to withdraw, allowing most of them to escape the encirclement. By this time, the Soviet command had understood that Germans had also captured Sevastopol, and when it was clear that the Caucasus overran the Romanian forces opposing them, then they broke into the undefended Axis rear, cutting off their forward units. They captured the railway junction of Velikie Luki. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, bypassed their line and encircled them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from two sides. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces. The Red Army encircled several German corps. The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force back to their front line as the last operation of the winter campaign. They attacked the flanks of the Army Group Center. The German forces were forbidden to retreat, and many of their units were encircled near the original front. Their southern forces were able to pull back further, but were also eventually trapped. The Red Army advanced towards Minsk. The Germans were unable to pull their remaining forces back in time, and they were encircled east of Minsk. With half of the Army Group Center's strength being destroyed, the Red Army's advance continued. One opportunity to stop the Soviet advance was to pull back part of the Army Group North and counterattack at the flank of the advancing Soviet forces. Due to strategic considerations, Army Group North took advantage of the vulnerable deployment of the Axis forces and managed to encircle part of them west along the plains to outflank them. As the Soviet Union, this allowed the Axis forces to concentrate on the southern Soviet spearhead and destroy it. Communications with the main Axis front had been cut. Began a costly operation to clear the city of the defenders. Weak German defense in the south and center was pushed aside, and the Soviet troops advanced quickly. But the northern attack got bogged down in Prussia and was unable to advance. The operations proceeded in a slower pace. In February, the Soviets expanded their flanks to the sea in the north and to the mountains in the south and pushed the German forces in Prussia into small pockets near the sea. Meanwhile, the Red Army had cleared Budapest. In mid-March, the Western Allies crossed the river in several places and moved into the German rear. They pinned most of their immobilized forces in place and then proceeded with an encirclement of the German troops in the Ruhr area. Having neutralized a large part of the German forces, the Allies spread out and moved through North Germany almost unopposed. By mid-April, their forces had reached the Elbe River, a line dividing the areas of responsibility of the Red Army and the Western Allies. At the same time, the Red Army destroyed most of the German forces left on the Prussian coast and deployed the freed-up units to the Berlin direction and moved directly towards Berlin, encircling the capital. Most of the German forces were left outside the city. Hitler then ordered them to move into Berlin, but they were too weak and were only able to fight their way out west. Thus, the Red Army was able to clear Berlin only in about 10 days. Soon the Soviet forces made contact with the Western Allies. By that time, Germany had lost most of its territory, the path west of the German forces in Czechoslovakia, and secured their surrender to the Red Army. And soon after that, the last remaining pockets of Axis resistance in Europe were liquidated. With that, World War II in Europe ended.